This is the last episode of What If, and in this episode, we're going to be asking ourselves the question, what if Hitler had won? So let's imagine that Hitler does win. How would that change the world? Well, immediately after the war, obviously, the Allied leaders would be taken out by the Nazis. So Churchill would die, Roosevelt would die, and Stalin would probably die too. And then Germany would look very similar to Nazi Germany. The arts would be censored. There would be no more jazz or rock and roll music. Movies would be pro-Nazi propaganda. Books would all have to follow a certain guideline. And there would also be no more Jews in Germany because they would have been completely wiped out by the SS and then France. Belgium, the Netherlands, and other European countries would either be under the control of Nazi Germany or be puppet states to Germany, just like in our timeline. But what about the rest of the world? Well, in America, for example, the Nazis would certainly try and start a war with them. But since the US military was much larger than the German military at the time, it's unlikely that Germany could have won against the US, even though American isolationists were very strong at the time, and there was a lot of anti-interventionism in America. I still believe that in the long run, the US would eventually join the fight because Germany did declare war on them, and America couldn't just accept that another powerful country just declares war on them and gets away with it. So the US would likely intervene later on in the war and help out the Allies. But let's say that somehow Germany manages to defeat the Americans and takes out their military bases in the Pacific, which is highly unlikely, but possible. Then what about Japan? Well, Japan was an ally of Germany and Italy, and they would certainly respect Japanese rule over East Asia, and so Japan would grow to become an even bigger power in the region. And because Germany controlled most of Europe, Japan would now control most of Asia, and Germany would control most of the world. But let's be honest, this is very unlikely to happen because the German military was not strong enough to take on both the US and Japan at the same time. At best, Germany would probably end up taking out one of them, but not both. So just assume that Germany takes out the US and Japan is still intact. In this new world, where Germany controls Europe and Japan controls the Pacific, the world would continue to be similar to how it was during the 1940s. Rock and roll and jazz music would be unheard of until the 1980s. Television wouldn't really become popular until the 1990s. The internet would be heavily regulated and censored by governments. Video games would be extremely limited. In terms of technology, everything would be similar to how it was in the 1970s. The Berlin Wall would never come down. The Soviet Union would probably continue to exist, and communism would continue to spread. We fast forward to today, the world would be a very different place. America would no longer exist as its own country. It would be divided between Mexico, Canada, and possibly some indigenous tribes. We would probably have a second American Revolution and a civil war in America. While Europe would be divided between Germany and Russia, America would be divided between Mexico, Canada, and the Native Americans. The world would just be in a constant state of war. Countries would be constantly fighting each other, and there would be no peace. There would be no United Nations because all the Allied nations would be defeated by the Axis powers. So there would be no international cooperation or anything like that. The Cold War would never happen, and there would be no threat of nuclear war between America and the Soviet Union. Instead, it would be a world war every few years. The economies of the world would be very different, since America would no longer exist. There would be no dollar, and global trade would be conducted in German marks, Soviet rubles, and Japanese yen. Japan would be the world leader in technology, while Germany would be the world leader in weapons and manufacturing. Germany would be especially good at weapons because the entire nation would be militarized. All men would be expected to serve in the German military, and women would also be encouraged to join military service. Everyone would be brainwashed into being a Nazi. From the moment you're born, you would be taught that Hitler was the greatest man who ever lived and that the Nazi ideology was perfect. School would just be one big propaganda session. Teachers would be required to wear Nazi uniforms, and there would be no freedom of speech. You could only speak Nazi-approved language. Since there would be no human rights, there would be no gay rights, no freedom of religion, no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press, no democracy, and no equal rights for women. Germany would probably become the largest prison camp operator in the world. Anyone who goes against the Nazi regime would be sent to a concentration camp. And when I mean anyone, I do mean anyone. It wouldn't matter if you're a Jew, a Christian, a homosexual, someone who speaks against Hitler, or someone who's simply a political dissident. You would all be sent to the camps where you would be worked to death or simply shot on arrival. And although the Holocaust would probably end after the war, since there would be no human rights, the discrimination of Jews would continue. They would continue to be treated as second-class citizens, and there would be laws that limit what they can do. Germany would also probably build giant walls around their country to keep people in and prevent them from escaping to other countries. Those who attempt to flee Germany would be caught and sent to a labor camp or shot on sight. The Germans would also probably take out all the Allied leaders: Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, Tojo, and maybe even Mao. Now, let's talk about how the Germans would treat the conquered populations. Well, the Germans would probably force everyone in the conquered nations to convert to Nazism. The people would be forced to wear special armbands. People who resisted the Nazis would be shipped off to concentration camps where they would be tortured, experimented on, worked to death, or simply shot on arrival. The Nazis would also use rape as a form of torture, and it would be common for German soldiers to walk into villages and rape as many women as possible. Children would be taken away from their parents and sent to special K-Nazi schools where they would be indoctrinated into the Nazi party from a young age. K children would be given Nazi uniforms and taught that Hitler was the greatest man who ever lived. They would be told that the other children whose parents were taken to the concentration camps were simply adopted by the state, and that they would never see their parents again. Life would be horrible if you were a slave or a prisoner in Germany, because the Germans believed in a master race and considered themselves to be superior to everyone else. They would treat slaves horribly, and prisoners would be given horrible food and clothing and would be forced to sleep in overcrowded cells. Prisoners would be shackled to walls and left to rot. The Germans would also conduct horrible experiments on prisoners, including vivisection, which is when you cut open a person's body without anesthesia to see how they react. If this is starting to sound a little bit too similar to our current world, you're not wrong. That's why it's important to remember the lessons of the past and fight against evil whenever you see it. Because if we had let Hitler win, the world would be a much darker place today. Thank you for watching.